of an increase in transfer payments. I did it with an increase in transfers. I could have done it with a decrease in taxes. On the right, I would have had exactly the same thing. So if instead of an increase in transfers, I said suppose they cut taxes by $50 billion per month, the analysis would be exactly the same. So you can change that plus transfers to minus taxes, you get the same thing. The big takeaway is if the MPC is less than 1, that is if we do not spend every dollar of the change in disposable income, which, you guys had an MPC of 0.32. It's pretty far less than 1. If the MPC is less than 1, then dollar for dollar, an increase in government spending has a larger effect on output and therefore on employment and therefore on unemployment than does that same dollar spent to increase transfers, or decrease taxes. That conclusion there is at the bottom of the slide. The conclusion that government spending has a greater effect on GDP than to changes in taxes or transfers, as I said, depends upon the assumption that the MPC is less than 1. If instead, why does this move so much? If instead every dollar of the change in transfer payments or every dollar of the change in taxes, if every dollar of the change in transfers or taxes was spent on consumer goods, that is to say, if the MPC out of the change in transfers or taxes was equal to 1, then there'd be no difference between the effect of government spending and the effect of the change in taxes or transfers. So government spending is more effective in changing output and changing employment and changing unemployment than is a change in transfers, social security payments and so on, or a change in taxes, income tax cuts and the like. That's a weird less than, isn't it? Let me fix that. Less than, there, that's better. So long as the MPC is less than 1. Well, let's look. How does the federal government spend money? Here's a picture. I think the picture's in your printouts. Is it in your printout? No? Oh, well, then I'll go over it really fast. The picture, which shows federal spending from 1971 to 2015, breaks out the G plus TR, the government outlays by the various categories. This thick line here is defense. Defense is part of government spending. So that's a component of G. Defense spending is. It went up, peaked during the Cold War, the Star Wars thing during the early Reagan years, went down, went back up basically starting 2001. Big increase in defense and then has come back down. Social Security and income security and health payments, those are all transfer payments. Health payments, most of the health payments there are Medicare and Medicaid payments. Medicare is payments for medical care for people over 65. Medicaid is payments for medical care for those who have very low, relatively low income. And the line here that's increasing most rapidly, that's healthcare spending. These include projections out for another couple of years. Those increases are not as steep as they had been before the passage of the Affordable Care Act. That actually, as I say, bent the curve, which means it brought the second derivative down. And the first derivative positive, second derivative less positive, which is to say bent the curve. You know what? Economists are real geeks and they think like this. It's kind of a scary thing. So there's healthcare spending there. You can see here it was down here at the bottom and it's really soared. Large, that's in part a reflection of the aging of the population. Medicare covers healthcare expenses for everybody 65 and over. Greater share of our population is now 65 and over and living a long time. This thicker line there, that was Social Security, again, demographically tied. Income security, that includes the unemployment benefits and temporary assistance to needy families. Hit a peak here in the 1990s, came down with the welfare reform of the Clinton administration. Oops, that's interest. Oh, my God, income security. There we are. Here's income security. Flat. There we go. Flat from the welfare reform. And then spikes here. That's better. Spikes with the rise in unemployment, then comes back down as unemployment has improved. The blue line, the one I was talking about, that's the interest payments on the debt. When the government borrows, they have to pay for the privilege of borrowing, just like all the rest of us do. Those interest rates went up, hit a peak here in 1991, and have come back down. What's left? Other. So there's one line here. Everything else that the government does is in this line here, that black line. That's everything else that the government does. So transportation, international affairs, space exploration, agriculture, community development, TARP, so the aid that it spiked and then it came back down. All of that's included in the other. Most of the other is government spending. The defense is government spending. These other things are transfer payments. Okay, so a lot of concern about federal spending comes when we start talking about deficits and debt. So let's first get our definitions right. Budget deficit or budget surplus. If in any one year government outlays, that is G plus TR, are greater than government tax receipts, which is the TA, we say the government's running a budget deficit in that year. If in any one year the G plus TR is less than the TA, if the outlays are less than the receipts, then we say the government's running a budget surplus. So a deficit is when you're spending more than you're taking in. A surplus is when you're taking in more than you're spending. Those definitions of deficit and surplus actually apply to anything you can think of. It applies to yourself as well. Budget deficit and surplus are measured on an annual basis. That's different than the debt. The government debt is the accumulation since the beginning of the country, and they start counting this in 1790 once we had the Constitution in place. Government debt is the accumulation since 1790 of those annual budget deficits minus the annual budget surpluses. So you add how much the government has borrowed minus how much the government has paid back, and you get the total amount of outstanding debt. When the government borrows, they borrow by issuing IOUs. Those IOUs we're going to call them government bonds. There's actually bonds, notes, and bills. So you don't need to worry about the difference between a bond, a note, and a bill. We're going to call them all bonds, which are basically IOUs that are signed by the Secretary of the Treasury, promising that the United States government will honor its debts and will pay back the holder of the debt. If you receive savings bonds as birthday or holiday gifts when you were growing up, that was lending. You had lent on your grandparents or aunts and uncles, whoever bought it for you, had lent money on your behalf to the United States government, and you asked for it back when you cashed those things in when you came to college. All right, let's look at some pictures. Here's a picture of government deficits. The red line, the top line here, top line at the beginning, bottom line at the end, is billions of dollars. The other line, the blue line, is the percentage of GDP. So the thicker line is the billions of dollars, and the thinner line is percent of GDP. And what you can see is, we go along, I started this in 1971. We had surpluses here in the late 1990s, so the changes wrought in the 1990s took us from pretty big deficits up to surpluses. That turned around starting about 2001. You can see the effect here of the 2007-2009 downturn, and then now that we're coming out of the recession and things are getting back to normal, those deficits are getting smaller. So right now, which is the percent, we're at about 2.5 to 3% of GDP is the deficit as a share of GDP. So let's see, that's on a par. I just draw a little line across. Where we are today is on a par with where we were 2001, 2002, and early 1990s and so on. We look at the total debt picture looks worse because anytime there's a deficit, and notice that most of those things except for the late 1990s are deficits, anytime there's a deficit that adds to the amount of debt, and so we have this scary looking picture here that shows the total dollars of debt. The top chart is showing you the dollars of government debt. That's the total amount of IOUs currently outstanding from the United States federal government, and then the bottom is showing that as a percentage of GDP. So the dollars keep going up because the dollars keep going up, but the economy is growing, and so the share of GDP has been fairly constant. This includes projections for the next few years. The share of GDP is fairly constant over the last 10 or so years shown on the chart. All right, so what do we think about all this stuff? Effect of fiscal policy on the deficit. First of all, if there is expansionary fiscal policy, which once again is an increase in government spending, an increase in transfers, or a decrease in taxes. If there's expansionary fiscal policy, that expansionary policy increases the budget deficit. That's just definitional. More government spending, more transfers, that increases the deficit. Less tax revenue, that increases the deficit. Expansionary policy, remember, also increases GDP. So if we're going to use fiscal policy to increase employment and decrease unemployment, that fiscal policy will also increase the size of the deficit. So policy that makes the unemployment problem less bad increases the size of the deficit. Flip it over. Contractionary fiscal policy, which by definition is a decrease in government spending, a decrease in transfers, or an increase in taxes. Contractionary fiscal policy, by definition, decreases the size of the deficit. Less outlays, more revenues. Either of those things makes the deficit smaller, and at the same time, those things also decrease GDP. That's why it's called contractionary fiscal policy. So policy to decrease the size of the deficit means there's less spending or there's higher taxes. All else constant, that's going to lead to a contraction of GDP. People laid off, more unemployment. Which means that if we want fiscal policy to be used to help end a recession and boost a recovery, that fiscal policy needs to be expansionary. Fiscal policy to end a recession needs to be expansionary. There are multiple concerns that are covered on the upcoming slides that are expressed about the use of fiscal policy and the increases in the deficits that result, the use of fiscal policy to end a recession. I don't anticipate getting through all 4 of these, but we'll just see how far I get. Okay. It's also covered in the book. So, all right, first, one concern is that using fiscal policy to try to end the recession tends to be a temporary stimulus. If you look at the ARRA, oh Lord, I always should write this down, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was the big fiscal policy passed in 2009 to try to boost the economy. That fiscal policy that was passed in 2009 was called priming the pump. Now, priming the pump, this is another one of these weird things that economists do. Way back when, most economists were people who had failed at physics. Seriously, like, they took physics 7B and failed it, and so they became economists. And so they borrowed a whole lot of language. You get multiplier, you get accelerator, you get velocity, you get concepts of priming pumps, all of these concepts that come out of physics. What can I say? So they learned some language and they brought it over. So priming the pump, when you prime a pump, it means that you're doing something, and I'm not a pump person. I've never lived on a farm. But priming the pump is what you do to the pump to get things, to get the whole like hydraulic thing, get the whole thing working, so that you prime the pump and then the water starts flowing, right? And then you can stop priming the pump, but the water keeps flowing. So that's what it means to prime the pump. Well, the question is government spending priming the pump? If they increase government spending or increase transfers or decrease taxes, if they provide a temporary stimulus, does this prime the pump in the sense that once they stop spending, is there something inherent in the economy that takes over and continues the spending? If they're going to increase government spending or increase transfers or decrease taxes, so they're going to increase the budget deficit for 2 years in order to get the economy moving, in order to increase employment, then when those 2 years are over and they stop priming the pump, they stop increasing spending, they go back to the, maybe write that word, they go back to the original amount of the budget deficit, such as you saw in the picture. Well, decreases in the budget deficit, that's contractionary fiscal policy. And contractionary fiscal policy means that there's less spending in the economy, fewer jobs, more unemployment. So the belief is that there's some sort of magic. You wish that economists hadn't answered what that magic is. There's some sort of magic that takes over, that the government can prime the pump, and then the government can step back, stop doing this with the pump, step back, and all of that spending will keep flowing through the system. Unfortunately, when the government steps back and stops priming the pump, that is to say, when the government steps back and reduces the deficit, that reduction in the deficit is contractionary policy, and that contractionary policy slows the growth of employment. So one of the concerns about the use of fiscal policy is that if it's temporary, then the boost of the economy is temporary as well. A second concern has to do with the difference between federal and state and local policy. Federal on the one hand, state and local on the other. The federal government has the constitutional authority and does run budget deficits. It can run a budget deficit. It prints debt, borrows from the world in order to pay its bills. State and local governments, by their constitution, with the exception of Vermont, why Vermont? I don't know. With the exception of Vermont, every state has in its constitution a requirement that it not run a budget deficit for ongoing operating expenses. The state governments can borrow for capital projects. They can borrow to build bridges. They can borrow to build buildings, but they cannot borrow to pay their employees. The federal government can. So the states can't borrow. Essentially, state and locals can't borrow, and the federal government can borrow. Well, what happens? In a recession, when there's a recession, income goes down. When income goes down, that means that tax payments go down. When people don't have jobs, right, on Monday, Cesar lost his job. That meant he didn't have to pay taxes anymore. And then after Cesar lost his job, Dane lost his job. That meant Dane didn't have to pay taxes anymore. So when income went down, tax payments went down. Cesar and Dane are thinking that's good. However, if you are the state of California, you're thinking that's not so good because the tax revenues go down. At the same time, for those of you in the room who had jobs where you had unemployment insurance, didn't include Cesar, sorry. For those of you who had jobs that included unemployment insurance, when you lost your job, you got unemployment insurance. That's a transfer payment. Transfer payments go up when there's a recession. So the very natural things that happen in a recession, 1, tax payments go down, and 2, transfer payments go up. Both of those things increase the size of the budget deficit. For the federal government, that's okay. They can borrow. And we saw the picture that showed the borrowing. State governments can't. By constitution, they cannot borrow. And so what state governments have to do when the economy goes into a recession is they have to cut their spending or increase their taxes in order to keep their budgets balanced. The economy goes into recession, fewer people have jobs, fewer people are paying income taxes, and the result is the state and local governments have to slash their spending. Public school teachers get laid off. Everybody at the University of California had a pay cut. Tuition and fees went way up. All of those kinds of things. That means that state and local governments worsen recessions. Not because they have to, but because they are by their state constitutions required to. State and local governments worsen recessions by the requirements of their state constitutions. Why it's in their state constitutions is a long discussion. It has to do with having a common currency. So one of the reasons that the euro is having some trouble in Europe is because they don't have this provision. So to have a common currency, you need to have one borrowing authority, which in our case is the federal government, and not the state governments as well. That's a whole other discussion. Take Econ 182 and you can talk about it there. All right. So what do we see? So here's a table from the BEA, remember those are the folks that give us the GDP numbers, that shows the contributions to the change in real GDP, and I gave you the data here for 2009 through 2012. So 2009 was when we had a decrease in real GDP. So real GDP fell by 2.8% in 2009. Why? It fell because consumption spending fell by 1.1%. Investment spending, let me back that up. Let me do it this way. GDP fell by 2.8 percentage points. 1.1 of those 2.8 points were due to the drop in consumption spending. That's better. A drop of investment spending brought GDP down by 3.5 points, offsetting those two negatives where net exports were going up and government spending was going up in 2009. So the economy was not as bad as it would have been in 2009 if the economy had been only consumption and investment. And then look at 2010. So here in 2010, what happens? In 2010, GDP grew. GDP increases by 2.5% in 2010. It's growing because consumption is growing. It's growing because investment spending is growing. Oh, oops, here's a negative. Net exports are declining. The decline in net exports is actually keeping the growth rate of GDP down. And then here's our state and local. And and the state and local governments are contracting. So yes, output and income were growing in 2010, but not by as much. There we go. But not by as much as they would have had the state and local governments not been forced to cut their budgets. There's a lag here because of the planning time. So the downturn hits, that lowers tax revenues, and then in the next budget cycle, the state and local governments have to cut their budgets. And so there's a lag in terms of when the effect kicks in. And then look more recently. Let me erase some of this ink. So more recently here, we've got the effect of the sequestration and other cuts. So the fiscal policy has been contractionary for the last couple of years. We've had economic growth, 1.6, 2.3% in 2011, 2012. It would have been larger had the federal government not been reducing the budget deficit, had we not had this contractionary fiscal policy from the federal government. All right, let me skip that. I've got 2 minutes. Let me think about which one I'm going to do. All right, I know I'm going to skip 2. Automatic stabilizers and discretionary policy you can look at in the, go down. There. You can look at in the book. I'll leave the book to that. Let me jump to this next one. How do we pay the bills when there's a deficit? Really important. The federal government does not print money. I know there's this great visual on the evening news of the printing press, and yeah, there is a printing press at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. What they're doing with the money that they're printing is replacing the dollar bills that have gone through the washing machine. That's all. So when the government runs a deficit, they don't print money to pay their bills, they borrow. And the annual amount of their borrowing is equal to that deficit, G plus TR minus TA. Who lends? Everybody. So this graphic, which is in bigger size here on the next page, and in your slides it was on the next page, the graphic shows who owned the debt, who had lent to the United States government as of March of 2014. And I'm going to go to the next one because it's bigger and I can see it better. What's next? There. 42%. 42% of the federal government debt was owned by the Federal Reserve and government agencies. So we got a lot of lending to oneself, sort of like having you and your siblings lending to each other. 34%, about 1/3, was lent to the federal government from international sources, be that individuals, governments, or financial institutions. And then there's a little spattering of other things. 6% in pension and insurance companies, 6% in mutual funds, some banks, some savings bonds, and a little bit of other. All right, y'all have a good day. What's today, Wednesday? Have a good weekend. Go Bears. See you Monday.